Good morning and welcome to the Japan Society's weekly webinar series on the repercussions of the global pandemic. My name is Bill Emmott and I have the honor of being chairman of the Japan Society of the UK. I hope you're all staying well and adjusting well to these difficult times, and I thank you for your support of the Japan Society. Last week, we discussed the strange absence of international collaboration with two very experienced speakers from the United Nations. This week, we are focusing on an area in which there really is profound and intensive collaboration, namely medical science, a collaboration on which both our personal and our economic futures truly depend. And I'm delighted indeed that this event is itself a collaborative one, co-hosted by the Health and Global Policy Institute in Tokyo. Since we in the public first became aware of the COVID-19 virus, we have all become much more familiar than we can ever have expected with issues of epidemiology, of testing and tracing, of respiratory disease, of oxygen deprivation, of immune systems, of candidate treatments, and above all, of vaccine development and research. But where have we actually got to now, on May the 12th, approximately 4 months since knowledge of the virus emerged? Amid unprecedented and huge medical and research efforts all around the world, what are the main developments and hopes or expectations that we can identify and try to understand? To discuss this issue and expand our understanding, we are privileged to welcome two of the leading experts in the world on this issue, who are also seasoned collaborators with each other. In Tokyo, I welcome my longtime friend and colleague from the University of Tokyo Global Advisory Board, Dr. Kiyoshi Kurokawa, Professor Emeritus at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies and chairman of an independent think tank, the Health and Global Policy Institute. He has advised many Japanese governments. He chaired an independent investigation commission into the Fukushima nuclear accident of 2011-2012, and for 2013 to 18 was chair of the Global Health Innovative Technology Fund in Tokyo, of which our London speaker was vice chair. Our London speaker is Dr. Piot, Belgian by birth, now director of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, a co-discoverer of the Ebola virus in 1976. He was the founding executive director of UN AIDS, and he conducted pioneering research on HIV/AIDS, particularly in Africa. Nowadays, as well as having been ennobled in Britain, in his native Belgium, and in Japan, he is a special advisor to the President of the European Commission on COVID-19 and the response. Most particularly, he is also a recovering COVID-19 patient himself, having suffered a severe attack and hospitalization. As usual, I'm going to ask both of our speakers to open up with 10 minutes each, following which we will have questions and answers submitted by me, but also by you, most importantly through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And I'm going to ask Peter Piot to open our discussion. Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bill, and good morning and good evening to everybody online. What's happening now with this pandemic, and pandemic is an epidemic that covers the whole world, is actually something that many scientists had predicted that this would happen. We just didn't know when. It's like the big earthquake, the big one in California, where we know that one day it will hit and even wipe out Silicon Valley and so on. It could be tomorrow, it could be in 100 years. And this had to happen because new viruses emerge all the time, people become infected. In it, we have zero immunity. They come from animals, so they're so-called zoonoses. And this is what happened. This is what happens regularly with influenza. That's why we have some minor changes and sometimes a big one, like 100 years ago with the Spanish flu. And that's what we're going through. And it really has turned into the greatest challenge in peacetime, really facing societies worldwide, not only from a public health perspective, but also economically. Officially, there are about 4 million people living, I mean, infected and got it, but the true figure is probably many millions more, because testing is still limited. We don't really know, and hundreds of thousands of people are died. And you know, the sobering reality is that we're only at the beginning of this pandemic, because there is no reason why this should stop miraculously, as long as, you know, there's so many people who are still susceptible. This virus is not only killing people, like 1%, more or less, and then many are asymptomatic, but also it can be very debilitating, and this is, Bill alluded to it, what I experienced myself. I now, 8 weeks ago, I was, you know, started to have the symptoms of COVID-19, and I'm still recovering. You know, it can affect every body organ and so on. So there will be a lot of chronic morbidity, maybe sequelae, that we have to face with in health systems and so on. Now, the good news is that, you know, quite a few countries have been able to, you know, contain the spread of this virus. But the reality again is that this may be temporary, and that we have to continue to keep the pressure on the virus. On the other hand, it's a trade-off. We also, the economy is collapsing, so we need to make sure that not more people are going to die from other problems, be pushed into poverty, while protecting then the spread of, you know, of this virus. So we'll need to rethink our strategies. And there is no precedent. We all have to learn while we're doing, and it's not always totally clear what we need. Now, on the science and on the biomedical part, the good news is that in contrast to earlier epidemics, the virus was isolated very, very quickly. Already on the 9th of January, the genetic sequence of the virus was published. That's very important, because on the basis of that, you can then develop diagnostic tests and even as a basis for a vaccine. And there is a lot of international collaboration, I must say, and an enormous scientific activity, massively, concentrating on 3 areas particularly. One is vaccines, and I will come back to that. 2 is a treatment, and 3, diagnostics we need to know. And there was an event at the more of the political level on the 4th of May, which was hosted by Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, and together with a number of countries. And Japan was one of them. And that was a pledging event, not a conference, because it's all virtual these days. And we also had a message from Prime Minister Abe Shinzo committing Japan's, you know, efforts in terms of, this was on research and innovation, to develop therapeutics and vaccines and so on. And that really was a very good expression of an international coalition. There was the UK and so on. Every country was there except the US, I would say. And that also builds on Japan's strong tradition and capability in life sciences and also in innovation, just as Bill mentioned, the you know, the GHIT, the Global Health Innovative Technology Fund that Professor Kurokawa Sensei founded, and I had the honor of being the vice chair. So that is in that tradition. So what is going on? First, we don't have a treatment yet, but there are promising candidates, and I think we'll hear from that from Professor Kurokawa. One, the US has approved one antiviral drug called Remdesivir, that seems to, you know, reducing the duration of disease. There are big trials going on, coordinated by the World Health Organization, and many countries are doing. Here in the UK, we have the so-called recovery trial, which is testing drugs that have been used to treat HIV infection, lopinavir and ritonavir, for those who are in this, but also looking at some type of steroids, dexamethasone, because in COVID-19, it's not only the viral infection, the virus itself, that causes the problems, but also the inflammatory response. That is at the moment my personal problem also. My virus is gone already weeks ago, but I'm still suffering from the response of the body and how to deal with that. And I think there was a lot of talk about hydroxychloroquine, an anti-malarial drug, but that doesn't seem to pass the trials at the moment. And then a number of so-called monoclonal antibodies, so antibodies that will attack the virus. So in other words, there's a lot going on, and I think that we will see some answers to the question whether these drugs work or not in a few months' time. And the only way to find out is to do these rigorous trials. It's not by treating here and there a few patients. That's why international collaboration is so important, to make sure we have huge numbers and that we can analyze that consistently. Secondly, on vaccines. And the reality again is that the only exit strategy, we talk a lot about exit strategy from this epidemic, is a vaccine. Because what are the alternatives? I mean, one, you never know that the virus may, through some mutations, become less pathogenic and so on, and less virulent. I wouldn't count on it, but that's a theoretical possibility, but there's no indication that this happens. Secondly, that about everybody becomes infected, and that would mean, millions of deaths. We don't want that. And thirdly is a vaccine. And so a lot of effort is invested in a development of a vaccine. There are about 100 vaccine candidates, but that I would say there are probably less than 10 that probably are serious candidates. For a vaccine, we need a few things. First thing, you need to demonstrate that it works, it protects. There's no guarantee. There are infections that have been around for a long time, and we've been spending billions and billions and still no vaccine. Take HIV, for example. But I think I'm more optimistic for COVID-19, so we need to go through clinical trials. Secondly, it has to be absolutely safe, because this is a vaccine that will have to be given to billions of people, billions. So it has to be absolutely safe. Again, that has to be tested in a very rigorous way. And thirdly, let's assume that we're lucky and that, let's say a year from now, early next year or so, we have a vaccine that works, or a few, hopefully. Then we need to manufacture billions and billions of doses. We're talking about 5, 6, 7 billion. Where are we going to do that? The capacity for this, even when you go through the nitty-gritty, are there enough glass vials to put all these vaccines in, and so on, and making sure there is equitable access. Not every country in the world is producing vaccines, manufacturing. So we need to make sure that what we call now vaccine nationalism is not going to take over. We need vaccines that will benefit the people from the UK, from Japan, from in Africa, in India, and so on. So these are some of the issues that I would like to highlight. So there are many, many unknowns, uncertainties. For example, all the various measures in the long term, societal measures, how effective they are, we're still learning. We still also need to know more about immunity. Are we protected? Someone like me, when you have infection, will you be immune for the rest of your life or only for a few years? That's also important for vaccine development, and so on and so on. So I'll stop here, Bill, but good progress. But I think we're really only at the beginning, and science and technology and innovation will be extremely important to bring down this epidemic, combined, of course, with the societal measures and also the damage limitation of all the economic impact that is also real. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. That's a very sobering but very realistic survey of what's going on and what the issues are. One of our speakers last week pointed out that while, of course, the medical science is a hard science, epidemiology is, in effect, a social science, and it's the interplay of these things that we need to watch in a very close way. Kiyoshi, Kurokawa, over to you, to Japan.
Thank you for inviting me to this great occasion. And in fact, Pete and I have known each other some 10 plus years on G-Hit Fund. But before that, I think I have been contacting with him, a great man, great friend. Now, this I was following from internet, what's happening in Wuhan, China in January. And I was sure it's coming either Korean Peninsula or Japan next. So I was expecting this to come somewhere, one way or another. Somebody in Wuhan area at that time, in some Japanese businessman or somebody who would fly back. So I was expecting that to happen. And all of a sudden came with Diamond Princess. That was a completely unexpected surprise because that's a mass. So that was a really big surprise, and which I was following on the media in Japan. There's a bit of mess in what to do because that was all of a sudden it came. And but then a few months later, a few weeks later, it's sort of resolving. But I was surprised by the fact American pull all the Americans on board and took them back to US. And that was a kind of surprise for me, but that was the thing that happened in that Diamond Princess. Then I started wondering what's happening in Japan too, in Diamond thing. And Dr. Iwata Kentaro made a sort of very well-known sort of video thing and criticizing Japanese government. But I think I knew him. He's a great physician and bacteriology guy. And so just he should have presented some solutions, a realistic solution we should do. And so but I admire his courage and what he has done, because then he was invited for briefing later by the cabinet, which is a good thing to do. Now then, I thought about Peter, because I've been working together on this G-Hit fund, and he was one of the experts, and I thought about no time to lose. This is really, within a month, it's become not a local epidemics, but pandemics. And spread of this coronavirus throughout the world become a great thing in this time of 100 years old of the Spanish flu. Now, this is a kind of opportunity, also virus and also vaccine and everything. But now with the internet, we can see what each country are doing. And we could learn and share how they reacted in this pandemic. And some countries did much better than others. So why is it? So this is a really social challenge in this global world. And if it is limited to only China, Wuhan, and Japan, not much sort of lessons we could share. So if you go back to the civilization, we have been always fighting against infectious diseases. They mutate much faster, and there's a lot of history from everybody now talk about Venice, pestis, all the things. And so this is a part of a new challenge for all of us. And now we could learn and share what are the better way to do this kind of pandemic. And this has been expected to happen sometime in 20 years ago. You know, like flu epidemics is coming, and that happened. And now it came and quickly distributed into the world. So I think we could learn a lot of lessons from what we do and vaccine, and this is a collective challenge as a human being and this global world. This is a very great opportunity. Now, in the past 10, 15 years, I have been working very closely with UK somehow among G8 countries. And I have worked very closely with Robert May, who was Chief Science Advisor to Tony Blair and G8 Summit. And we worked together at that time to deliver a G8 Academy statement to the G8 Summit at Glen Eagles. So that became a first attempt, and then that became a sort of part of routine G8 over the last several years. And that time, I think our Prime Minister was Prime Minister Koizumi. And so that G8 Summit again, and continue this G8 Summit Academy statements to the head of states continue for several years, but I'm not so sure recent days. And then I become a friend of David King, who is the chief science advisor to Gordon Brown. So we communicated fairly well to maintain this science community's voices to the head of states. And so that when Toyako Summit was hosted in Japanese government, again, we delivered the same statement on energy issue and a few other issues. And we directly presented this statement to Prime Minister Koizumi. This kind of sort of past history with me, with UK, is really kind of reminding a relation over many years. And I always claim Japan and the UK are two countries quite crowded, but adjacent to the big continents. And so we share a lot of history when Japan opened up 150 years ago. Now is David Cameron and then John Bellington. We invited John Bellington to give a seminar during the Fukushima accident. He made a statement to Japanese community. Whether radioactivity was safe enough, so do not much worry about havoc. And that was his statement, really helped us to convince the Japanese government at that time. And so these are the stories. I think I have been working very closely with Bob May, David Cameron, and then Mark Wolpert. So that's, I think, then just you came, Emmott came with University of Tokyo Council, stayed together. So then Peter with G-HIT Fund. So I have somehow personal very attachment to the UK government and the UK science. And then Martin Rees was also the Royal Society. And I visited Martin Rees a few times in his office. So now I think in the corona, we are expecting this is coming to Japan. But that came with Diamond Princess. It was hard to manage in that thing and become an incubation vessel at that time. And all of a sudden it spread out, not much trace. But now I think it's coming down, and Japanese, particularly in Tokyo, now number of new patients, at least PCR positive, is coming down very fast right now. But the question to Japan is why number of testing is so low, but yet so the mortality rate seems to be reasonably low in Japan and also in general among Asian countries. And I'm suggesting, because Korean did very well and responded very quickly, and at least they did very well, so why don't we learn and share the lesson and the better practice in Japan? That has been my argument to certain Japanese government leaders, because that was sort of, I thought, one of the reasons, one of the responsibility I could make as an independent scientist in this country. So that has been my work over the last few weeks, was working together with Avigan and Fujifilm to develop a clinical trial right now. Now it's started. We enter because we have to have at least controlled clinical high quality study of effect of this Avigan in this corona influenza. So that was my major work over the last maybe 2 months. It started a few weeks ago, which was great. And I also asked Japan Medical Association to help this process or persuade patients coming into this trial. So that's been what I've been doing over the last few weeks. It started, so I'm anxious to see the results. All right, that's my sort of opening, what I have been doing right now.
Well,
and also, yeah. And then I was surprised to see Peter got this disease.
Well, thank you. I'm sure Peter was just as surprised as you were, even more so. But thank you very much, Kiyoshi. That's been very interesting background, especially, and very inspiring on the UK-Japan history of collaboration. I think to open the questions, we've got a number coming in, but the structure that Peter laid down of about vaccines, diagnostics, and treatment, I think we could focus on those during the discussion, and perhaps. Let's start with the treatment and then maybe diagnostics and then vaccines. You, Kiyoshi, you've mentioned Avigan, this Fujifilm treatment. What are your expectations and what are your feelings about that? And generally, to what degree can treatments, and this is for both of you, really be expected to mitigate the fears and the severity of this? Can we expect a lot, or should we be more realistic?
I'm not so sure, but I followed also the Wuhan case in China, and they have done a great job just testing many medication and close the city, all the things. But they also tried Avigan too, because this was out of patent a year ago. So they just tried it and also synthesized it, and according to their data, it seems to work very well. And they published many papers on this thing. Within maybe seven days of treating, giving this Avigan in a little bit of much higher dose than ordinary flu, but it worked very well based on PCR. So I was expecting when this comes, I think I called Fuji right away, let's prepare, do something. And in fact, in this Avigan, when Fuji was working on this Avigan thing, because of flu epidemics, flu is coming, and so I just, they came to ask my opinion, and I just made a suggestion. Why don't we do it? Because this is a simple chemical compound and for flu. So they did a flu study. And then there's not much enough case, but that was 20 years ago. And then US government has a large grant for flu, some medicine for flu. So they said, I suggested them to try this in the UK trial, and they did that. And apparently it was effective. So they approved, this Avigan was approved by Japanese government based on combined Japanese studies and larger US studies. And then when Ebola outbreak again happened in West Indies, and I called this company right away and whether, do you have any data on Ebola virus? And they said they have. So I just get this data right away, and there's a nice dose response, which is a bit higher, one which is higher than sort of flu virus. But I send this data immediately to Piot, because he's an Ebola man. So just I suggested him, this drug has been approved by flu, but at least there's the data for Ebola. So as you see, it's fit, which never tested in human, but it's tested and it worked in that time. And perhaps I think that so because he's an expert on Ebola, so I shared this data with him. And now I think it has been shown to be effective. I don't know how much effective, but at least effective in this West Indies case this time, and Congo too. So that's all the history. And then now real coronavirus, another flu came. So just I have been working to helping Fuji to have a clinical trial on coronavirus, which is a bit different than the other influenza. So that has been my primary work over the last maybe 4 or 5 weeks. Now it started.
Peter, how about your thoughts on this? I mean, what should our expectations be for treatments? I mean, in terms of the significance that they can bring in terms of turning it into a management issue rather than a mortality issue.
Yeah, I think it's really key. I mean, one, this is now what we're seeing is the natural history of the disease, and then with some life support, you know, oxygen and ventilators and all that. treating bacterial pneumonia and what have you. So we desperately need treatment. And it's not only important to reduce mortality, but also you could imagine that if there's treatment, we could give it to prophylactically to contacts, like in a household. If someone has the infection, you could already give it as some prevention so that people don't develop the disease. So it is absolutely important. Now, I think it's pretty complex at the moment, and the only way to find out whether a drug or an approach, could be antibodies or so works, is to do the trials, and that's for me a top priority. And these are going on, and as Kiyoshi has said, that's also Avigan is being tested and others. But my expectation will be that we will probably need different types of treatment for different stages of the infection, of the disease, and we have to see the top priority should be reduce mortality. That is the first priority, and that can be tested in hospitalized patients. But it may be that we need to start treating quite early on in the infection. That is kind of the experience also from Ebola. Once you have also this coronavirus, a so-called, a multiple organ attack, cytokine storm, as they say, it may be too late for any treatment targeting the virus. So we need to treat before. That's one thing. And there are a number of candidates. And as I said, I expect that this is a matter of, well, maybe 1 to 2 months, and we will know already which ones that work and which ones don't. But then we'll have to go for much finer, treatment options like the immune response. So a lot of the problems in COVID-19 are caused not just directly by the virus, but the body is overreacting. And so that's why, for example, in this trial in the UK, the discovery trial, recovery trial, that paradoxically, an immunosuppressant, dexamethasone, which suppresses the immune response, is being tested. You could say, how can you do that? What is a virus? We need our immune response. Well, it's exactly because there is this overreaction. So, and my expectation is that monoclonal antibodies or antibodies will probably be also play a role. So we have the, chemical components, small molecules, as they say, like Avigan. That's definitely very important to kill the virus. Antibodies that will also target the virus. And then we have the, let's say, the supporting the immune response or suppressing it. So that all that together. But the good news is there's a lot of international collaboration there. Some of it coordinated by WHO, some, spontaneous. The next stage, and that is, the prophylactic type of use and what we call post-exposure prophylaxis. A lot of infections now are happening in the household. People are living together. One gets infected, and then, or it could be also in the work sphere and so on. So there's a lot of potential, particularly since I expect that we will have much faster evidence for what works and what doesn't work in terms of treatment than for a vaccine. Vaccine development is extremely complex, as I try to illustrate, and delivering it on a large scale will take time also. So that's what we can expect over the next, I would say, what are we? So by July and so on, we should have a really good picture already.
Okay. One of our questioners has sent in a question specifically about plasma therapy, which you could to Takeda. This is, I take it, in the antibody category that you're talking about.
Well, that's a good example of what we have to try. I mean, and I know like Japan is playing quite a role in there with the Takeda. So what is the principle is that someone who is survived the infection, like me, like I, so you produce massive antibodies and all kinds of immune defenses that are, in your plasma. And so if you donate your plasma and that's then being given, to a someone who's ill or critically ill, that may save the life of that person. It can be the whole plasma, or it could be the antibodies, neutralizing antibodies to be specific, that are being isolated from that. And also their trials have started. They're complex also because here we're using biological materials for people who have recovered, so we need to be absolutely sure that there is no live virus in there, no other things and so on. But yeah, so that is an important approach that also has been used for other infections in the past.
Perhaps we should move for a moment to diagnostics, and to, I think, one puzzle for many of us as laymen is that has been the difficulty of rolling out tests, not just in terms of capacity, which is of course an important part of the issue, but also in terms of accuracy and speed, and both for detecting the virus as an infection, but also the antibody tests. I wonder if each of you could comment on your expectations and your feelings about the likelihood that diagnostic tests are going to develop fast enough to be of significant assistance. Perhaps Kiyoshi, start with you.
Yeah, right now at least PCR is one of the definitive tests for this virus or the fragment of virus, but the number of testing in Japan seems to be a bit lower, quite lower compared to other countries. So this is some of the things of decision-making process of perhaps in Japanese government. I think we should really encourage them to do that. And another one is, of course, not only antigen or part of this antigen, but also antibody. Because once you have an antibody, at least you become immune. So less likely to get sort of through this coronavirus. And again, the number of testing in Japan seems to be a bit lower. And I'm really encouraging them to even practice, private practice, and somebody has a flu-like syndrome and they are worried about this, potentially this could be a corona. So I'm really pushing them to just send this out to any sort of diagnostic biochemistry lab, the private sector, and why don't they do that and just accumulate more data in antibody and also PCR and even antigen. But implementing this kind of procedure seems to be very slowish in Japanese government at the moment.
Peter, what is your reflection on the efficacy and accuracy of the testing?
Yeah. First of all, I think that testing should have a much more central place with this epidemic. I fully agree with Kiyoshi, and particularly now also that many countries are going into a phase where the number of new infections is going down. So it'll be important to know who's infected, not only for epidemiological reasons to document it, but also to identify those who are infected and their contacts. So the basis for later containment will be identifying those who are infected and all their contacts who are at risk. And that requires massive access to testing. UK has not done well on that perspective either. There are several issues. One, the accuracy of tests can be a problem, but for the PCR, so diagnosing the acute infection, I think we're fine. The tests are quite good. But for a so-called antibody test, an antibody test detects whether you have been infected in the past. You have antibodies. These tests have not been yet been well validated, but I think that, again, that's a matter of weeks or a month or so. There are now some that are properly validated. That'll be very important for estimating the extent of the problem, and also maybe reassuring people who were mildly infected, symptomatic or asymptomatic. They can find out whether they're were infected or not, and have antibodies. Whether they're then immune or not, that's an open question. But I think that there's a reasonable chance to assume that that's the case. Now there are issues. One, the demand exceeds far the supply. So that is, there is enormous demand. But some countries have done very well in terms of testing. I mean, Korea, for example, yeah, Germany in Europe, for example, they were very early on and produced the tests. Secondly, some countries have had an over-centralist and government type of approach to testing. That was the case in the UK and in other countries, in the US also, ironically. And we need to involve, you know, labs. Ideally for me, this is a test that you should be able to buy at a pharmacy, just like a pregnancy test, as long as it's fully accurate. We're not there yet, but we will get there. So it's really, let's say, bureaucracy, policy, decision-making, where the attitude has been more like, how can we limit, you know, the number of tests, rather than to say, we must have this test widely available. And so, but I think that, again, there is a big change, and again, we're learning. But without massively investing in testing and doing it in a creative way, not a bureaucratic way, is going to be absolutely key to control this epidemic.
Is there?
I agree with.
No, Kiyoshi, over to you.
Yeah, I agree with Peter, because as we accumulate more data, we could see what's happening in this community. And I think without data, it's very difficult to evaluate how this epidemic is spreading out, how the human contact is evoking these issues. I'm really pushing this antibody and also PCR, regardless of whatever. You know, just patient and community become much feel safe, or at least they are assured we are safe or not. I mean, that is so not coming down, but at least assure the community we have been doing the right thing for you guys. So that is the reason this very small amount of PCR or the testing in Japan is a bit worrisome for me.
Yeah, I totally agree with Kiyoshi. Also, we will probably have to go in the future with more selective type of measures. So, you know, the same policy for a whole country where some regions have really hardly any infections and others have hotspots. Or we see, for example, in the UK, care homes for the elderly are really where the epidemic is today in a big way. We need to know and protect people that way. So that is, yeah. So we have no choice. We have to move full speed with this. Yeah.
And a question has been asked, I mean, that alludes to something that Kiyoshi said earlier, which is asked about: is there any evidence that low that have been seen in some essentially North and Southeast Asian countries are related to anything scientific as opposed to public policy? And when for example, ideas have been floated about the prevalence of the BCG vaccine as a universal measure in the past. Is there any scientific basis for judging this question?
Well, the data seems very firm, at least in the BCG thing in Japan and the other countries. And I think this is a discovery by Jun Sato-san, whom I do not know because he's not a physician, but I think he has his own sort of blog. When you follow this thing, there's many questions about this, but this is a very interesting observation analysis, and some try to do BCG injection again. So I think I like to know what's happening here, and I think we like to discuss this issue more openly and testing this thing too, because at least there's a clear difference between this BCG effect, at least in Japan and some other countries, how to develop this BCG vaccine thing. It's a very intriguing observation, in my view.
What do you think, Peter? Or other like background vaccines, like pneumonia vaccines and PCG vaccine, are they part of the game?
Well, I think the BCG vaccine observations are indeed, I would agree with the word intriguing that Kiyoshi used. And but it, again, as everything else, it has now to be confirmed whether it's true or not. What will be very important for in terms of vaccines is when the next influenza, the next flu season comes up. You know, in the northern hemisphere, like in the autumns and winter, is that, people take massively that vaccine because can you imagine a bad scenario would be we have a second wave of COVID, of coronavirus, and in addition, lots of influenza cases. Not only will that lead to a lot of confusion, but we could have synergies. The health systems may be really overwhelmed and so on. So that's something that we need to prepare for. It's not because we have COVID-19 epidemic that all the other infections have disappeared suddenly. And so that is one scenario that I'm kind of worried about. And so a good vaccination campaign for an uptake of influenza vaccine will be very important. And that uptake is not so great. Also, the vaccine is not 100% protective, but it helps a lot, and certainly to reduce mortality.
And I mean, following on from that on vaccination, a question from Francesca Alonso: when a vaccine is found, should it be compulsory for all of the population? So let's go away from the equity of distribution, but for a moment we'll put that on the table. But is it necessary to make it compulsory, given the number of resistances there are to vaccination in many countries?
Okay, maybe I'll give a shot at it first. This is a really very good and pertinent question. What we've been seeing over the last maybe 10 years now is a paradox in our times of high tech and scientific achievements, where vaccines saved literally millions of lives every year. And some of us may not be here without a vaccine, when we were vaccinated as a child or later. And yet, there are growing the number of people in some countries. It's very patchy. It depends on the country, that are refusing to have their kids vaccinated against measles. So, for example, we have measles epidemics, killing children, giving them encephalitis and so on. And how will that play out when we have a vaccine against the COVID-19? We don't know. And one approach has been against this vaccine refusals to make vaccination compulsory, like in Europe, in France, and in Italy. And I think, to be honest, I don't try to duck the question, but that's a debate that we should have. And we need to be prepared for that before we have the vaccine, not when the problem explodes in our face. Over.
Kiyoshi, what's the situation in Japan?
Yeah, no, I think there's many theories of why this corona flu is a bit different, because I wasn't sure, because usually that's common flu. You have some sneeze and this and that, and that's all the stuff. But this, not much symptoms, but hypoxia. Somehow, with the peripheral, this alveolar cell that's attacking right away, and it sort of binding, or the receptor seems to be angiotensin converting enzyme 2, and this is clearly distributed that area too. So I'm not so sure how Peter, as a physician and virologist, felt when you get this. This hypoxia, but not much of sort of a hypoxic common flu type of symptoms, it seems to me. So I wanted to know how you describe your disease.
Well, it's actually in several phases. Initially, it was fever, myalgia, the classic viral infection with some terrible headache, and particularly completely exhausted. I try to continue to work. I mean, I've never been seriously ill in my whole life. So, and I'm a bit of a workaholic, so I continue to work. But then at some point, the fever was too high. I just had lost all energy and and strength. And that's when I was hospitalized, where they discovered I have very low oxygen saturation level. I was not short of breath, but it was at such a very low level, and that I needed oxygen. Okay, I went that, and then I went home, and then a week later, so after 7 days in the hospital, a week later, I started becoming short of breath, and I live in a house, all the English house in London, you know, 200 years old, you go up and down the stairs. And okay, that's good exercise normally. And then what happened is that it really being short of breath, still very exhausted. And that's when the inflammatory response hits you, no longer the virus, and that your lungs are becoming invaded in a sense by all kinds of debris and you know, but now I'm fine. But it's in several phases. But there are people who develop cardiac complications, kidney, neurological, and also very not only headache, but also my skin was very sensitive. You know, skin lesions have been described. This is a virus. Think of it as something. I mean, it's a respiratory transmitted virus, but that doesn't mean it only attacks the lungs. It's everywhere. And you know, but the most striking thing is that for me, you're totally exhausted. You can't do anything. I mean, I had no energy to do that, but it's all back, no problem. Yeah.
No, that's the reason. It is a very sort of asymptomatic hypoxia, if you measure that. And that's the amazing thing.
Yeah.
Very strange. That's what I saw.
Yeah.
And then sort of intravascular coagulation, all the things that.
Oh, yeah.
Now, coming back to the
yeah.
Sorry, Pete. No, I was going to come back to this question when a vaccine is available. You know, I've featured in the Japan Society blog the Oxford trials, where there's even talk of something being available in October. But what about the task of actually distributing it and getting it evenly? Article in today's FT probably benefited from conversations with Peter about vaccine nationalism and the dangers of that. How could we expect this to play out, and is there a role for the private sector in UK and Japan in trying to ease this problem in distributing, in enabling equal and widespread access to the vaccine against this nationalistic trend?
Yeah, there are some, I mean, it's not unexpected, but every government wants to make sure that their citizens are protected. But we have a global problem. And in the US, for example, there is the Trump administration has said that the vaccines manufactured in the US should be reserved for America. If every country does that, there will be a lot of countries that are going to be excluded because very few countries actually produce vaccines on a large scale. And also so let's assume we have one, and indeed the Oxford trial, they're the most advanced, but we need billions. First of all, you know, manufacturing sufficient quantities in terms of billions and billions. That's the first attempt. And in Japan, I think, has the capacity to do that, and not billion, but enough for Japan and even more. Secondly, we need to make sure that there is some equitable access, that those who do not, you know, manufacture vaccines are going to benefit. So that's why we need this international collaboration and an agreement which cannot be enforced. And also there's an access issue for low, middle-income countries, particularly low-income countries, who's going to pay for it. And there are very advanced and good discussions going on with pharmaceutical companies, because there are very few manufacturers of vaccines in the world. It's not like for therapeutics. There are lots and lots of them, not for vaccines. And that's where they talk to each other. We have something that's called CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Information, which was established after the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, which killed 11,000 people, to support the development of vaccines that are where there's no market incentive. And Japan has been one of the founding members and supported. And that it provides a platform for discussions between governments and also companies, big pharma, but also some manufacturers like in India is producing a lot of the vaccines for low-income countries. In Japan, we have several companies. There is a facility in Japan for in case of pandemic flu that could be used. And I believe that's with Takeda. So I think that we have to work on it, but it's going to be very difficult because we are in a world where often the nationalism and protectionism is predominant. I'm not against patriotism, but I think nationalism and closing the borders and all that will in the end hurt everybody. But Kiyoshi, about Japan, maybe you can also there, yeah.
Kiyoshi.
Yeah, at least this is a global challenge, and this will return again and again in the long future. So at least we have to focus on this global world and global challenge, and we have to really collaborate. And that is a vaccine thing. And even the serum is this, and that's only transient. I think vaccine, we have to have a collective endeavor and effort, and there's no question about that.
Can pharmaceuticals companies in Japan play quite a disproportionate role in gearing up the manufacturing in the way that Peter was mentioning? Is there that spare capacity?
Well, at least, therefore, this is a matter of perhaps also the policy matters. And WHO and CEPI was produced created because of that, and Japan was a part of this initiator of the CEPI. So these are the new challenges. We didn't expect it that much, but there's always a flu epidemic. There's always warning to us over the last 2 decades. But now it came, and this is a bit noxious. That's what it is.
Just one common theme in some questions, perhaps I could ask for a minute or so on comes back to the public policy and epidemiological approach, mentioning Sweden and a lot of attention being given to the more relaxed Swedish system of restrictions and questions about immunity, which is not so different from the Japanese policy, actually, I think. I wonder if either of you have comments on Sweden, but also perhaps on this question of whether public policy, government policy, is being challenged and scrutinized strongly enough from within and from outside, or whether we are all just having to lay back and trust.
But in a way, I think this is a really global challenge. But I think because of digital connection and this corona epidemics, world epidemics become a sort of challenge for us to the way we work and when we educate and sort of research, all the things become global sort of endeavor. And I think this is really testing our sort of wisdom of before corona and after corona, kind of BC and AC. And this has a really big impact because this has a common global agenda, not national agenda, which is a great opportunity to really try to change the global world for the future. That's in my view.
Yeah, I agree. I think that when you look just Europe, I mean the EU, 27 member states now, each one has a little bit of a different approach, and also in terms of timing. What probably is very important is when do you start taking all these measures, and some are early on and others late. But I think, to be honest, the jury is still out in a sense what ultimately will be the best approach. But I would say something in between, let's say the Swedish approach, which is not as lax as sometimes is presented, you know. Also, there is already some kind of change in behavior and a more draconian approach, like bulldozer approach, call it, you know, everybody, total lockdown. What we should make sure in the early phases, act early and make sure that people don't die. I mean, that is really key. Not, I would say, just betting on let everybody get infected and have herd immunity is not something I would advocate. We can do more. But I agree with you, Bill. I think since this is all new, since nobody has ever tried this before, we need to constantly assess, scrutinize, not in a political way, because a lot of these debates now are, okay, you're in the government, I'm from the opposition, so what you're doing is bad, etc. No, it is really document very well and try to adjust whatever we do when we think it's not going to the right direction. And so I think and that's not very expensive, but some rigorous, constant assessment scrutiny, both on the scientific side, but also, of course, as a public policy issue, both have to be taken into account. Because just imagine that you're the prime minister and you have to take some decisions and choose, in a sense, between lives and livelihoods, to use that slogan. We need, we can't push whole countries into poverty. On the other hand, we can't be lax and let people die. So these are extremely difficult and unprecedented challenges for those in power. That's why I'm kind of more maybe milder in a sense that say, but the scrutiny, holding accountable, I think is really key, not going to a blame game, but then also for politicians, those in power, to have the courage, said, okay, that didn't work, or we were wrong, no, let's try that one. And looking also at other countries, learning from each other, because some have more experience because unfortunately they were hit first or they acted earlier. And that should go across borders. I mean, in general, I could say that Asian countries have been far more, earlier in their response, particularly those who were hit by the SARS epidemic. That was still in the, in that experience, in the collective memory also. In Europe, we were in most cases a bit late, but so let's learn and learn and learn and learn, and then act and act and act.
No, well, I think that's a very fitting way to conclude our discussions. It's not a blame game; it's a learn game, and we've benefited greatly as the Japan Society from both of you in helping to learn where things are going, where can we realistically expect to go, and what are the important things to look for. And I hope that we can keep in touch with one another about how this all develops, and in particular about when important new things occur to be learned from and from each other. And I thank both of you, Peter Piot and Kiyoshi Kurokawa, for sparing your time and your great expertise, warmth with us and with all the society members, and the collaboration with the Health and Global Policy Institute, thanks to Kurokawa Sensei and thanks to his colleague Noritake Ryoji, organizing that collaboration. So thank you to all of you, thank you to all of our members, and especially thank you to you, Peter and Kiyoshi. Have a great time. We will keep in touch.
Great, thank you.
Thanks a lot.